Welcome back. Today's story is about a woman who went for a walk in the dark and never came back the same person. What she found on a park bench that December night cost her everything she thought she was, and gave her everything she never knew she needed. I found them at 10:30 on a December night in a park that was nearly empty. Two children on a cold metal bench near the water. The older one was a girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. She was holding a toddler against her chest, her lips faintly blue, tears freezing on her cheeks. The boy was clutching a stuffed rabbit and barely moving. I removed my coat without thinking and wrapped it around both of them. My name is Mara. I am 36 years old. I had gone for a walk because my therapist had suggested movement, and because the alternative was sitting alone in my apartment thinking about my mother's empty chair at Christmas for the third year in a row. I knelt in front of the girl and asked where her parents were. She looked at me with eyes that held a weight no 4-year-old should carry. She said they didn't have parents. She said their sister had left them there and promised to come back, but that was a long time ago. Her name was Emma. Her brother was Lucas. Their sister was 28 years old. Their mother had died 2 years earlier. I called for an ambulance and police and held both children against me until the warmth came back into them. The officers took my information, and I assumed my involvement was over. I was wrong. The case unraveled quickly once the police started pulling threads. The children's mother had left a trust fund in the care of their older sister Leah, who had full control of the finances. The monthly allowance was supposed to cover care, housing, and schooling. What it actually covered was Leah's lifestyle. She had been stealing from the trust for years. She had placed the children in a warehouse daycare instead of the private school she was reporting to administrators. She had sold the apartment, liquidated the remaining accessible funds, and was at a train station with 2 suitcases and a one-way ticket when police found her. I started attending court dates I wasn't required to attend. I hired a private investigator. I discovered that Leah had burned through over $200,000. I discovered that Emma and Lucas had spent 6 months being systematically underfed through neglect so complete it amounted to something worse than intention. I discovered that Leah's defense attorney, a man named Daniel, was preparing a case framing her as a victim of addiction who needed treatment rather than prison. He was polished and well-connected, and he had won cases like this before. I became angry in a way I had forgotten was possible. Not the hot kind that burns out quickly, the kind that settles in and breathes when you breathe. I spent 2 months gathering information. I spoke to caseworkers, nurses, teachers. I documented Emma's nightmares and the way Lucas flinched at sudden sounds. I collected medical reports, psychological evaluations, photographs of the apartment where they had been left alone for days at a time. I compiled everything into something so thorough and so specific that it could not be dismissed. Then I found something else, something that changed the shape of the entire case. Detective Raymond had originally investigated Leah's situation and closed it quickly, stating there was insufficient evidence of criminal intent. But I found documents suggesting that 3 weeks after he closed the case, he had received a consulting payment from Daniel's law firm. I want you to stay right here, because what happened after I sent that information to the FBI is something that cost more than I expected, and the ending of this story is not the clean, satisfying one that most people want. Subscribe to our channel right now, because part 2 is where I tell you what justice actually looked like and what it cost me to get there. I sent everything to the FBI. The documents, the timeline, the payment records, the detailed history of Leah's case, and how Raymond's closed investigation had nearly allowed her to disappear entirely. I included every letter I had written, every piece of evidence I had compiled. Then I waited. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, Leah's case went to trial. My evidence had reached the judge, and he had seen enough to want answers. Leah was convicted of child abandonment, embezzlement, and fraud. She received 3 years in prison, which felt inadequate given what Emma and Lucas had lived through, But 3 years was something. It was more than she would have received if Daniel had successfully reframed the entire thing as a mental health story. The corruption investigation was messier and harder to live with. Raymond died before he could be arrested. I have never let myself feel relieved about that. He was a man who made terrible choices, but his death felt like something I had set in motion, like a thread I pulled that I did not fully understand the weight of. Daniel had his law license revoked. He died of a heart attack several months later, at 56 years old. I tell myself these outcomes were consequences of their own choices, actions put into motion long before I found 2 children on a bench. That is true, but I was also the person who made those consequences impossible to avoid. I have thought about that distinction more times than I can count, and I have never arrived at a clean answer. I became the legal guardian for Emma and Lucas 6 months after that December night. It was not supposed to happen that way. I had no family connection to them, and there were proper procedures and other options. But I had made myself into the person most invested in their recovery. I had documented every step of their progress, every need, every milestone. The court recognized that, and I recognized that the court was right. 3 years later, Emma is 7 and Lucas is 5. They go to a real school with art classes and a library and a gym where they can run. Emma still has nightmares sometimes, and Lucas still startles in the dark. But they laugh. They argue with each other the way siblings should. They have inside jokes I only partially understand. I left my old job and founded a small nonprofit focused on trust fund fraud and financial abuse of vulnerable people. I used the same skills I used in those 2 months of documentation to build cases and hand them to investigators who can act on them. I am not a savior. I am someone who learned to channel a specific kind of anger into something that occasionally looks like usefulness. Last week, Emma and I were making cookies, and her hands were covered in flour, and she asked me why I decided to take care of her and Lupus. It was a simple question, asked with complete trust, and I had to think carefully before I answered. I told her that sometimes people come into our lives at exactly the moment we need them, and sometimes we come into theirs at exactly the moment they need us. I told her I had made a promise to her and Lucas, and to myself, and that I do not break promises. She nodded and went back to the cookies, satisfied the way children are when an answer feels true, even if it is not complete. I did not tell her the rest, the part about what it cost, the part about the 2 months I spent in documents and evidence until I was not entirely the person I had been before, the part about Raymond and Daniel, and the things I set in motion that I cannot fully claim or fully deny. I do not know when she will start asking the harder questions, when she will look back at the story of those years and want to understand all of it, including the parts that do not resolve cleanly. That day frightens me more than I can say. But today she is 7, and she has flour on her nose, and she trusts me, and Lucas is asleep down the hall, and he does not wake up afraid the way he used to. Those are the things I come back to when the other thoughts get loud. I paid for what I have now with something I cannot get back, which is the simple belief that the system is enough if you wait long enough and document clearly enough and trust the right people. I do not believe that anymore. I believe the system is a living thing that can be corrupted, and that sometimes someone has to be willing to do uncomfortable things to clean out the infection. Whether that makes me someone worth admiring, or just someone who got lucky that their methods produced a defensible outcome, I genuinely do not know. I think about that question more than I think about almost anything else. What I know for certain is this: Emma and Lucas will grow up knowing they are worth fighting for. They will grow up knowing that the people who failed them were held accountable. They will grow up in a house where someone chose them deliberately and completely, and has never once looked back. That is what I bought with everything I spent. I keep asking myself whether the price was right, and I keep arriving at the same place, which is that I am not sure I get to make that judgment. The only people whose opinion would actually matter on that question are 7 and 5 years old, and covered in cookie dough. I will ask them again in 20 years. If this story made you think about something you have been sitting with quietly, then share it with someone today who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel because we tell a new story every single week, and not one of them is going to waste your time.